Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. It's time for another monthly wrap up. But before we dive in and I discuss the books which I read in November, I'd like to take a brief moment to talk about a few new books which I've picked up recently. Recently, I've picked up 3 amazing new books which I can't wait to get started on. First up, Halcyon Years, which is Alistair Reynolds' new release. This has got a very intriguing cover design. I think you'll agree. I'm very excited to get started on this one. One thing I didn't realise until after I picked this book up is actually a signed copy. So I can add this to my collection of signed Alistair Reynolds books. Can't wait to get started on this one. I'm saving it until January because I've got a buddy read which I arranged with a couple of other booktubers. So yeah, we'll probably follow that up with a video discussion on my channel, so have a look out for that. That's probably going to be one of the first books I'll read in 2026. Another book which I picked up recently, this was actually given to me as a birthday present a few weeks back, is Mort by Robert Rapino. Which has got quite an intriguing premise. Something I'm very much interested in reading. It says a feline assassin searches for his lost love in Rapino's strange, moving first volume of the epic War with No Name trilogy. So yeah, a feline assassin, that could be interesting. This is also going onto my 2026 TBR. It's probably something I'll read quite early on in the year. And finally, now this book just came totally out of the blue. It arrived in the post a few days ago. The Fifth Head of Cerberus by Gene Wolfe. So someone sent this to me as a surprise, and they ordered it from my Amazon wish list. So thank you so much to whoever sent this. It came with a gift note which says, "Enjoy your gift from John V. Marsh." John V. Marsh is actually the name of a character from this book. So it's quite mysterious. Whoever sent this. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I think I'm assuming the reason someone went out of their way to order it from my wish list is because in the Alistair Reynolds interview which I posted recently, this was the book that Al recommended. When I asked him to recommend a novella, he recommended this book, which is a collection of 3 novellas. So again, I really appreciate this, and it would be remiss of me not to read this or to put this in my 2026 TBR. I'm definitely going to read this book now. I do like Gene Wolfe. Haven't read him for a long time, so I definitely need to read that one. Let's move on to my wrap up. So November. For November, I had a bit of a theme going, which I called Novella November. And so I've just been reading novellas, like a whole bunch of novellas recently. During the month of November, I got through 12 novellas. That includes 2 audiobooks. And what I think I'll do is, because I think this is going to be more interesting, more fun, if I go through these, if I rank these in the order that I enjoyed them. So I'm going to start with my least favourite up to my favourite, the highlight of my novella reading in November. And I'm going to start off this list with a slight sort of an honourable mention, if you like, because I'm going to start this list by talking about Who Goes There, which is not technically part of my Novella November because I read this at the tail end of October. So it's actually a 13th book, but it did kickstart my novella reading spree. so I might as well include it in this list. And actually, it's appropriately at the bottom of the list because it's my least favourite out of all of these novellas that I've read. So it might be more appropriate to call it a dishonourable mention. I really struggled with this novella. It was a massive disappointment for me because I really liked The Thing, the classic 80s sci-fi horror movie, which is based on this novella, right? But the source material, couldn't get on with it at all. The writing was very clunky, the dialogue was wooden, the characters were instantly forgettable, and even though it's only 75 pages long, reading this story felt like wading through treacle, right? I would say this is probably my biggest reading disappointment of 2025. So I've talked about this in my last wrap up already, so I don't think I need to add any more to that. So let's move on to the list proper. So Novella November, at number 12, I'm going to go for The Captain's Daughter by Philip Jose Farmer, part of this collection called The Alley God, which is a trio of novellas from the 50s. This story was originally published in 1953 in a magazine under the title Strange Compulsion. And it's a kind of mystery set on board a spaceship in which there's a kind of bizarre parasite that's going around. It's infecting members of the crew. And there's also a kind of murder mystery going on. There's an apparent suicide, which is actually a murder. It's a kind of pulpy tale. There are some sexual themes, which were probably quite provocative at the time it came out. As a premise, it's not a bad idea, but the story was kind of bland and suffers from forgettable characters like Who Goes There. It was okay, but nothing special. So probably my least favourite of the month. And then we move on to number 11, and which was also part of a collection. And for this, I'm going for Firewalkers, which is part of Adrian Tchaikovsky's collection, Terrible Worlds, Revolutions. The stories in this collection are all grim dystopias. And this particular story is set in a future which has been ravaged by climate change. The super rich are emigrating out into space, while the rest of us are left on Earth to survive in a desperately scorching world. And in this story we follow 3 young workers who are known as Firewalkers in a mission across the desert. This is my least favourite of the 3 novellas in this collection. Felt a little bit YA-ish with these young characters. It was a bit of a slog to get through. The story seemed to drag. It's not to say it's poorly written. It is well written. There are some interesting ideas, some interesting world building. It's just not a standout Tchaikovsky story, in my opinion. Among those that I read, it seemed to drag on far too long. The next story is another one from Philip Jose Farmer's collection, Back to the Alley God. This story is called The God Business, which is another early to mid-50s story published in a magazine originally. This is an incredibly weird and trippy story. It's kind of hard to summarize. But basically, it's about what happens when a college professor decides to make himself a god, basically. He declares himself to be a god. and he takes over this Midwestern American town and he turns it into a kind of surreal domain where the normal rules of logic don't apply and the authorities are powerless to stop him. And that's about it, really. This whole story seems to be some kind of bizarre satire, I think, on religion and religious personality cults. I've read a fair bit of Philip Jose Farmanao, and I've discovered that religion is quite a sort of recurring theme in his work. This story is quite entertaining in an absurd way, but it's so weird and so chaotic in the way it's told. It's kind of hard to understand at times. So I don't think it's one of his best, but it is a lot more entertaining than The Captain's Daughter. Then I'm going to move on to The Tusks of Extinction by Ray Naylor. And this story I listened to via audiobook. And this story is notable for having won the Hugo Award for Best Novella this year. So it's quite a recent one. There's a really intriguing premise on the theme of the resurrection of the mammoth. It's very thoughtful. It's very introspective in its writing style, just like The Mountain and the Sea. We've got themes of animal exploitation, climate change, and the interconnectedness of living beings. It's definitely worth the read, especially if you like thought-provoking or philosophical science fiction. For me, I did enjoy it, but I found the story a little bit too slow-paced to really pull me in. There's a lot of introspection in this narrative. There's quite a lot of flashbacks. It's a quality read. It's got literary merit, but I wouldn't really call it a page turner. Obviously, page turner is probably not the right word to use because I listened to it via audiobook. But if you do listen to the audiobook, another thing you should know is there are two narrators, right? One male, one female. And the male narrator has an extremely deep voice, which takes some getting used to, which might be a little bit too much for some people. It's probably the deepest voice I've ever heard. That's no exaggeration. I found the female narrator much easier to listen to. So that may have affected my experience of the story. Perhaps if I'd read it physically, I might rank this book a little bit higher. Anyway, I'm glad I listened to it. The next story I'm going to talk about, I can't remember what number I'm on, but the next one on the list is Ironclads. So we're back to the Tchaikovsky collection. Ironclads, which is the story that opens this volume, is another grim dystopian tale. This one is something of a kind of military sci-fi story about a rescue mission, which is very entertaining. It's action-packed with some interesting social commentary. I did enjoy this one overall. No real complaints, but I wouldn't say that it's a story that will stay with me. It's not Agent Tchaikovsky at his peak. I've already forgotten a lot of the details. And again, like the last Tchaikovsky story I mentioned, it felt a little bit too long. But it's a decent read. Next, Tendaleo's Story by Ian MacDonald, which I read here as part of this duo. Peter F. Hamilton on the back. But I read the Hamilton story before. So Tendaleo's Story. I enjoyed this one. It's a really solid sci-fi novella. It's a kind of first contact alien invasion story told from the point of view of a teenage girl from a Kenyan village. It's a really interesting idea. We've got this alien life form that takes the form of this kind of plant life that is gradually taking over the whole southern hemisphere, or the land area of the southern hemisphere of Earth. And it's creating these kind of strange areas of land, kind of like weird zones, basically. There's definite weird zone vibes in this story. The characterization in this story was very compelling. I like the fact that it's set in not your typical Western English-speaking setting. And it did get me intrigued to explore more of Ian McDonald's work. There are, in fact, other books set in this same universe. It's called the Chaga series. So I'd be interested to check out more of his work. The next story I'd like to talk about is a classic, The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin, which has been on my radar for quite a long time. It's the one Le Guin novel which I hadn't got around to reading. I just never picked up a copy of it. This one also won the Hugo Award for Best Novella back in 1973. And it was a bit of a spur-of-the-moment decision for me to actually listen to the book in this case, because I don't have a copy of it. So I decided to listen to this as another audiobook. And it didn't disappoint. I think Le Guin is a consistently good storyteller, in my experience. This is a story on the theme of colonialism and exploitation and environmentalism. And it's a kind of reverse alien invasion story in which human colonists settle on an alien planet, right? The land area on this planet is totally covered in trees. And the humans basically enslave the natives and embark on mass deforestation. And we follow the narrative from both the human point of view and also the alien point of view. So I really enjoyed this. It's well written, it's thoughtful, the characters are interesting and well developed, and once again Le Guin uses her kind of anthropological background, which she excels in, to create vivid and interesting world building. I don't think it's the best thing she's ever written. It's not as deep or as impactful or as innovative, I think, as something like The Left Hand of Darkness, but it's still a great read. And now I'm going to move on to the final Philip Jose Farmer story, which is actually the story which opens this collection, and it's called The Alley Man, which I think is a much stronger story than the other two, which I've already talked about. This was originally published in another magazine in the late 50s, and it's got a really compelling concept, I think. It's about a man who claims to be the last living Neanderthal, and he lives in the back streets of a 20th century American city. I'm not really sure which city it is. I don't think it's named, if I remember correctly. But anyway, he lives in a pretty wretched and impoverished existence in this slum, right? And we follow the story from the point of view of a young graduate student who is fascinated by him and has decided to study him as a kind of anthropological project. Now, there's not a whole lot going on in the story, but I do think it's an excellent character study. It's kind of left ambiguous whether this guy whether he's really a Neanderthal or if he's delusional. Okay. And to be honest, he's not really a likable character. He's actually very unpleasant. And this may be a barrier for some readers to enjoy this story. But I do think he's an intriguing character, and even if he's not likable, he is complex and believable. And you know what? This story reminded me of another SF story that I once read called The Gnarly Man by L. Sprague de Camp, which is also about a Neanderthal who is living in modern times. And I think in that story's case, he's actually an immortal. And it's not left ambiguous, if I remember correctly. It is made clear in that story that he is actually a real Neanderthal. Whereas in Farmer's story, it's never really made clear. And I think I preferred Farmer's approach. So in a way, it's even kind of debatable whether this is actually a science fiction story, because you can take away the sci-fi elements and it's just literary fiction, right? Which is pretty unusual for Farmer. This story has definitely got more of a literary quality than his typical work, which is often kind of pulpy. The other two Farmer stories were really pulpy. It's a great read in any case. Okay, we are now down to the last four, which, as far as I'm concerned, are the cream of the crop, because these are all excellent novellas. Like 4.5 stars, 5 stars. The Dagger in Vichy, number 4, Alistair Reynolds, new release for 2025. Really enjoyed this one. This is a story about a troupe of travelling actors in a far future France that has regressed to a kind of medieval-like state. And I don't think I need to say much more than that. Because in the Alistair Reynolds video, which I had recently, in which I talked to him, we talked about this novella. So if you want to learn more about this story from the author's point of view, you can have a look at that video. I can definitely recommend it. It's beautifully written. It's a really immersive story. I found the world building really atmospheric and intriguing. And I think this kind of regressive, low-tech future society interacting with advanced technology, this kind of trope, which it kind of reminds me a little bit of A Canticle for Leibowitz. I don't know if there's like an official or an accepted term for this kind of subgenre in science fiction, but I like to call it sort of feudal future, right? It's something which I'm really intrigued by. And I think that brings me neatly on to the next novella, which I'd like to talk about at number 3, which is Ogres by Agent Tchaikovsky. So again, we're back to this book. This is the last story in this collection. It's another dystopian tale, and I think it's head and shoulders above the other two, at least in my opinion. And yeah, this is another example of feudal future. The ogres in this title of the story refers to a group of genetically enhanced people who rule over the rest of humanity with tyrannical cruelty and oppression. And we follow a young male peasant who has grown up in a village under the yoke of this kind of feudal regime. And it's a really interesting story. And the interesting thing is, Tchaikovsky makes a very intriguing stylistic choice in narrating a story in the second person, right? So the protagonist is you. It's not I or he or she, but you. And this is only the second time that I've come across this in a novel. The last time I've seen the second person used like this was in the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. It sounds kind of weird, right? Perhaps even gimmicky. But actually, I think it works just fine in this story. it doesn't feel unnatural at all. You very quickly get used to it. But in any case, the writing is really compelling. It's an enthralling story, very satisfying read, and unlike the other two novellas by Tchaikovsky, which I've just talked about, I was never bored with this story. Great pacing, interesting reveals, great payoff, fantastic sci-fi novella. And we're down to the last two. So, my second favourite novella, which I read last month, was Behold the Man by Michael Moorcock, which is an absolute classic of new wave science fiction. I don't actually have the book with me, but the book that I read was actually the expanded novel version of what was originally published as a novella in New Worlds magazine in 1966, but in any case, it's a short novel, and this is a time travel story with religious themes in which the central character travels back in time to seek Jesus of Nazareth, but he's shocked to find that Jesus is in fact a drooling idiot. So this is going to be quite a controversial one. If you're religious, if you're a Christian, you might find some issues with this novel, but the way the story is narrated is very clever. It's a really fascinating character study with some great time travel concepts and quite a powerful anti-religious idea, I think. It's a little bit different to your average time travel adventure. Well worth a read, I think. And finally, I'm going to finish off this list with my number one pick for Novella November, which is The Dead Lady of Clowntown by Cordwainer Smith, which I read in my Rediscovery of Man collection. This is a very strange and immersive tale. It's beautifully written, and it's got a sort of powerful and timeless theme on non-violent resistance against oppression, right? It's the story of the underpeople, these kind of animal-derived people who have been oppressed for many generations, and it's about their struggle to be given dignity and human rights in the instrumentality of mankind. And it's about the dawn of a new spiritual awakening in humanity. I don't think I need to say any more because I have uploaded a full review of this story on this channel if you'd like to know any more. Phew. This is quite a long one, isn't it? That completes my Novella November wrap-up. Some really great reads in there, which I really enjoyed. And as you can see, there's a bit of a recurring theme, actually, of social commentary. There's a lot of powerful social commentary in these stories. Ray Naylor, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Ursula Le Guin, Cordwainer Smith, it's all there. Anyway, let's move on. Let's take a look at my plans for December. So, in December, the one book which I really want to read in December, I don't actually have a copy of yet, and that is Claire North's new release, Slow Gods, which I should have a copy of soon. I've been in touch with the publisher, Orbit Books, I think it is. I asked them if they could send me a copy in exchange for an honest review. This is a book which I'm very excited about. They said they are sending me a copy, right? So thank you very much to Orbit for that. Hasn't actually arrived yet, but I'm very excited to read that. I'll read it as soon as I can. Another book which I am thinking of reading this month is Catface by Clifford Simak. Now, I really want to read some more Clifford Simak before the end of the year. I absolutely loved City, which I read as a buddy read quite recently, And I wanted to read another Simak novel before the year is out. And yeah, this one kind of intrigued me. This is the cover. This book is also known as Macedonia. That was the title. I think it was released in the US. This is the UK title, Catface. So yeah, I will read this. I'll read Slow Gods. Apart from that, I don't really have any commitments in terms of reading this month. I might finish Who Goes There, because this is actually, it's not just a novella, it's also a collection of short stories by John W. Campbell. Hopefully they will be more enjoyable to read than the title novella. I need to give Campbell another chance, and I don't really like leaving books unfinished. So maybe I should aim to finish this before the end of the year. Aside from that, though, if I find myself with some extra time for reading over Christmas and New Year, I'll probably go for a bit of a mood read. I'm not going to commit myself to anything now. But that said, I do have a few books here which I'm very tempted to read. And all of these books have been on my radar for a very long time. For example, A Case of Conscience, which is a classic novel with religious themes by James Blish. I do really want to read this novel. It's been on my radar for ages. And A Time of Changes by Robert Silverberg, with this absolutely amazing cover here. I'm sure I will enjoy this novel. Or Alistair Reynolds' short story collection, Zima Blue, which I got him to sign just recently, back in September. So I do really want to read this collection. And The Man in the High Castle. Absolute classic, of course, by Philip K. Dick. All of these books I've been meaning to read for a long time. Anyway, that's about it. This has been a very long video, much longer than my usual wrap-ups. So if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon for some more sci-fi content.